You're listening to a podcast by Adelaide West Uniting Church.
So we got to introduce this somehow. Now, my brain's a little foggy after all of it, but...
Hello, and welcome back to Open-Ended. Today we're going to be talking about baptism. It's going to be heated. There's going to be all sorts of theological blood spilled. It's going to be just...
It was not. But we did. We started with the themes of baptism, so just to set the scene. Yeah. I'm not sure where we went after that.
No, we went through infant baptism.
Baptism in some depth.
Yeah, or not, if it was just a little sprinkle on the top of the head. So
pouring, no sprinkling.
We passed through the waters of infant baptism and out the other side into full immersion.
Yeah.
We discussed whether we need to be baptised.
Yeah, what actually happens sort of communally, internally, individually.
Experientially.
Different reasons why people choose to get baptised, what it means for them. How everyone's wrong except Craig.
That's normal.
Well, yeah.
We always do that every time.
To be honest, we take that as given when we open up.
That's
it's
right.
It's an exercise in futility.
Well, it's helpful because it means then we can actually go, but I don't agree with that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I hope that you agree when I talked about how when it comes to the question of baptism that we go with an open mind and don't judge.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I was right about that.
Oh,
Yeah.
Well, there wasn't much we disagreed with at all.
No, there wasn't.
A
couple of points here and there.
Yeah, that's right.
But we did bring...
if you do disagree, please email lynn@aluck.
But while we agreed, we all did come from quite different places, and I think, we all kind of brought some different perspectives to it as well, because all three of us have had quite different experiences of baptism as well, which you'll hear us talk about in a moment. So it was another good one this week.
I think so. It was
Pour yourself a cup of coffee.
It was
settle in.
Yeah.
It's going to be a big one.
Listen to a good chat. Welcome to Open-Ended. I'm Lynn.
And I'm Craig.
And I'm James. This week we're exploring the question, do we need to be baptised?
Here we are again.
Yeah, and welcome back to our podcast.
I almost said it was conversations, but it's not. There's the other one that's open-ended.
Open-ended, that's right.
Should we start with what does a baptism look like within the context of the Uniting Church? Like, what are the Uniting Church rules on baptism?
Because this is a little bit interesting, because you've come from a Churches of Christ background.
Yeah, where there's no rules.
Although
really.
Not just Churches of Christ, so you have a varied, Pentecostal.
Well, I was baptised Pentecostal, actually.
Okay, and then Uniting, and then Churches of Christ, and then you came back home.
Yeah.
So I've had 6 years in a Pentecostal church, so I've got a little bit of a difference. You've also been Churches of Christ.
And then Baptist, and then... United Church.
Okay, so we're beautifully ecumenical. I like that.
I got baptised as a kid in Church of Christ as well. So, but from
not as an infant though.
No, I was 11.
Right.
Trying to keep up with my younger sister who beat me to the punch. So, yeah. I'm not going to pretend like that wasn't a factor. It was absolutely a factor. But we'll probably get to personal experiences about it at some point. But I think we should probably start general and just go,
generally for the Uniting Church, baptism, there's some key themes in baptism, which probably go across denominations, but this just helps to, I guess, ground us in the Uniting Church. So participation in Christ's death and resurrection, clearly. Mm-hmm. Cleansing from sin, clearly that beautiful symbolism of the water, washing us as we go down. The reception of the gift of the Spirit, or just that receiving of the gift of the Spirit. Not saying that that's when you receive it, but it's just that acknowledgement of the gift of the Spirit, the incorporation into the body of Christ. And I think all denominations see that you become a member of the Church Universal. through that. And in fact, on the back of the Uniting Church baptism certificate, if we do the baptism according to certain words, then that is recognised. And the list is like this across, but not Churches of Christ. And not Baptist, but, across many denominations, including Orthodox and Catholic and Anglican and so forth, we all recognise each other's. That I didn't say that. I'm just saying there are a number. I suspect that infant baptism may be why a couple of the other mainline denominations aren't a part of that because of that difference in expression. And then the last one is that it's a little bit hard to understand, but it's manifestations of the sign of the kingdom of God and the life of the world to come. So there's a little bit like communion, which is a foretaste. Baptism is also a bit of a foretaste of what is to come. They're the 5 main themes that the Uniting Church or the Assembly would say are part of baptism. And for the Uniting Church, that can be either a believer's full immersion baptism, or it can be a baptism with using the pouring of water, and they do call it pouring, not sprinkling, but the pouring of water from the baptism font is also for children or for adults, and then also infant baptism. So recognising that in scriptures where it talks about baptism, it talks about families, and it doesn't talk about families and not the babies or not the toddlers. It talks about families being baptised. So in the Uniting Church, we can also baptise infants. It's not called christening. It's called infant baptism. There's a really important difference between those two. Christening can almost sound like naming, whereas this is infant baptism. And part of that then is when you're baptised, your surname isn't used. There's actually your first name and any middle names, but not the surname, because you are baptised into the family of God. So there's some important symbolism there. That probably went a bit deeper than what you were asking.
No, that was good. Because I guess
Thank you for tuning in.
Episode done.
We're done.
I think I was just wanting to get that as kind of like a basis, just so I could kind of get a general foundation of some description to kind of then launch off from. And I figured, whatever the Uniting Church's position on it is probably a good thing that we could use as a solid ground to then start pulling some stuff out. I think maybe we should go infant baptism first, because that was kind of the that you spoke a little bit about that there. I mean, Craig, you'll probably have a better idea of sort of different schools of thought on why people do certain practice baptism in certain ways and not others. So do you have much of an idea of what the thinking behind
infant baptism
versus alternatives?
I mean, so you essentially have two schools of thought. You have infant baptism and you have the believer's baptism. And a believer's baptism specifies believer because the theory or the hypothesis here, I'm prefacing that like that because it gives you an insight into what I actually believe about this. The theory behind it is that baptism is something that you enter into as a rational decision, knowing what you're actually entering into. You're actually deciding to give your life to Jesus, and you're actually just choosing to enter into the mystery of his life, death, and resurrection by passing through the waters, going under the water, symbolising the death, and then the coming out of the water, symbolising the rising with him. Infant baptism, I think, really becomes quite popular in Christendom. It probably wasn't a common practice in the early church, although I'm not going to say that they didn't do it, because I don't think that's true. As Linda's already said, there's a good chance. Although whether children were considered part of the household or whether they were considered chattels in the ancient world is it could be debated, and their space for that for people who don't.
I can even imagine a scenario where it's a case of if the parents who are the heads of the household, essentially them coming to faith, then because that was such a rarer thing early on, obviously, it then kind of fundamentally shapes the dynamic of the family and the value set within that. So baptizing children along with parents in that kind of context, to me, makes a lot more sense, because the way the household functions and what that family means has shifted. Whereas I think because Christianity is, a pretty significant part of our culture still, it's baked into the shape of the way everything is set up now. It doesn't mean the same thing in that in our current cultural context, I would imagine.
But I mean, like, it does also open the ugly spectre of people being baptized on behalf of other people as well. So there's even a possibility that if the heads of the household were baptized, the whole household was baptized. But don't want to pull that through because it's too scary. It leads to Mormonism. In Christendom, you have the situation where essentially everyone is Christian by virtue of being born into the kingdom in which they live. There's not a membership into the church so much as now the question is, how do I know that I'm saved? And so the sacraments become important for saying I'm saved into the kingdom of God. I'm saved for eternity. And so children are baptized because there's a high infant mortality rate, and there's a fear that these children will die in a state of ungrace and not actually be able to go to heaven. And so you have this greater influence on infant baptism. But that aside, I actually have no issue with infant baptism. Like, my personal opinion is that baptism is a mystery. If you believe that you can actually be clear-headed and rational about giving your life to Jesus, then you're insane. Like, giving your life to Jesus is all-encompassing and it destroys your life. Like, you can't save your life without losing it. So
picking up your cross is not exactly a good self-preservation technique.
Exactly. So if you think you know what you're getting into when you're baptized, you don't, because you don't actually know what's going to happen to you when you go into the water and come out again, because you've never experienced it before. And it's a once-off thing. So whether you're an infant or whether you're an adult, it's still a mysterious process that you're entering into. So the whole premise of rationally choosing to get baptized, I think, is erroneous, and therefore I have no problem with baptizing infants, because they have less understanding perhaps, but in other respects, they have the same understanding, if not more, because Jesus actually said, enter the kingdom like a little child. And here we are actually entering children into the kingdom. So, I don't have a problem either way, but certainly the origin of infant baptism probably has its roots in Christendom and in infant mortality rates and the fear of parents that their children wouldn't be saved. Because in Christendom, you have to receive the sacraments, or you are in a state of sin. You need to be in a state of grace in order to go to heaven. So the baptism is essential for salvation, essentially.
Which then begs the question, is baptism essential for salvation? Which I wasn't sure how quickly we're going to get to this part of the conversation, but
we've got there quickly.
Yeah, no, this is good. We're making good time. This will be a short episode.
I don't think so.
No, I don't think so.
I don't think so. I couldn't even play devil's advocate on this one. I was trying to think of a way to, but yeah.
I think it's very clear in Matthew 28, Jesus talks about baptism, going to the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and then teaching them to obey my commands, or something like that. So I think we have two sacraments in the Uniting Church, in communion and baptism. And certainly by that command, I think there is a sense of obedience in there, that you get to a point where you go, well, I want to follow you, Jesus. There's a public testimony. There's a declaration of faith. Jesus was baptized. He actually identified with humanity through his baptism. So if Jesus was baptized, well, surely I need to be, it's sort of that. I think there is an obedience that is a part of that. And if it is an act of grace, why wouldn't we be lining up for it? Yeah. I mean, there's the one side that is the obedience, and the other side of God, when can I be baptized? Because this is the most amazing act of grace.
I have to clarify that the word sacrament means different things depending on which denomination you come from. So for a Roman Catholic, a sacrament is necessary. You can't not have a sacrament Whereas I think
not in most
other denominations, a sacrament, and I think perhaps even the Churches of Christ view on this might be helpful, that they tend to shy away from the word sacrament and would rather say that Jesus commanded us to be baptized, so we should be baptized, and that makes it a special act. And when you have a special act, sometimes you just need a word that says this is a special act. This is a special way that we honour God in our lives, and hence we call it a sacrament, because it's hard to describe it any other way than to say, like, in this event something happens that is transformative to you, but not necessarily not necessarily what the full it's not fully salvation. It's not necessary for your salvation.
Yeah. I think I probably come down similarly with baptism as what I do with communion, in that baptism for me is not necessarily a sacrament, but it is a medium for something that is ineffable and sacramental in and of itself. So, the transformation that happens within baptism can happen in other ways.
Yeah.
And if it does happen in other ways, I think you can still, we've all had multiple death and rebirth and, dying to your old way and picking it up again, I think you've said before you have many conversions over the course of your life.
Exactly.
It's, we're continuously coming back to faith. So we arguably go through many baptisms throughout our entire life, I think there are some periods of renewal and rebirth that take so long that I think that having a moment where you can say, I went into the water and I came out and that was the moment. There's something nice about having a marker in time for something that can otherwise happen over many, many years. And even if that mark is just a line in the sand, it's still helpful for, kind of, I'm going to say compartmentalizing, but like in a positive way, to say that, that was the point at which I started I became the person that I am now, because I don't think anyone exists in a static state either. But it's a lot easier to think about things if you imagine it that way.
Yeah, there's a strong sense that there's it's like an initiation, right?
Yeah,
you're initiated into the family of the church.
That's right.
Yeah,
and I think that's interesting because for me, and we haven't talked about our individual baptisms yet.
We will get there, I'm sure.
But I was baptised as an infant. So for me, it's not a marker in my journey with God. I was baptised. I was actually the first baptism at Wayside Chapel in King's Cross. And that's written on my baptism certificate if I could find it. But, and then basically I wasn't brought up in the church. So it wasn't until I became a Christian in my mid-teens that you went through, and that was at the height of the charismatic renewal. A lot of people were being rebaptised, not formally because you can't, but there were certainly plenty that did that. So for me, it was going through confirmation and acknowledging that baptism, which was a marker, but it wasn't the actual baptism itself. And I can remember I studied at Tabor in my early 20s, and I remember being in a sacraments class where I was the only one that had been baptised as an infant and not rebaptised. That made for some interesting debates, really interesting debates. Now, the Uniting Church allows for reaffirmation of baptism, and I've had the joy of being a part of a couple of those where people go, well, look, I have been baptised, but I'm looking for that symbol of water. And so to go down into the water and to come back out again, acknowledging that's what God had already done for them, but there's that symbolism that they can take from that moment, that declaration of faith, now that they're adults or teenagers and so forth. And so it becomes, we're able to do that in the Uniting Church. And I think that's a beautiful way of acknowledging that baptism in the past, which is about what God does. So that's why going back to infant baptism, it's about what God does, not what we do. So therefore, if you are baptised as an infant, like I was, it's what God does in that moment, not for me as a 5-month-old baby.
Yeah.
It's actually what God does. And someone many years ago, I think I was at Tabor, which is interdenominational, and a Lutheran spoke to me, and he'd had they had 5 children or something, and they were all baptized as infants. And he said to me, he said, if we believe God does something, why don't we get our babies or our infants baptized? And it just changed my thinking in what actually happens with baptism, that it's all about that mystery and what God does. But nevertheless, we didn't do that for our children, and they were both baptized down at the sea as teenagers. So, but nevertheless, I think there's something to be said for that, and it changed my thinking. How did we get to that? I felt like I was going somewhere, and it's
No, that's
gone.
okay. Well, you went somewhere interesting.
Oh, did I? Good.
No, I enjoyed the ride. It was good. There's a thought that might be about to elude me a bit that I was thinking when we were first mentioning infant baptism as well, is that there is a certain welcoming in and commitment on the part of the people witnessing the baptism
Yes.
to bring the child into the Christian community. And so it's almost that infant baptism is almost more for those outside the water rather than necessarily for, the child's own personal convictions, obviously.
Yes.
Especially because, and this is something that came up for me when I was reflecting on my baptism, is that even though I was old enough to make my own decision, I was still young enough that I didn't really have an old life to die to.
Yes.
Because any sinful nature, it's like I was still learning how to be a human being. I was 11,
That's right. Okay.
I was obviously trying my best to, be a good person and everything, but
Mind you, anyone who says that an 11-year-old can't be sinful doesn't know 11-year-olds.
Well, yeah. No, but that's what I'm saying though. Is that it's different to if you're an adult and you've been pursuing status and money and playing the world's game basically, and then you come across this radical internal transformation. You really directly encounter God and the gospel. Then for me, it's the there's a similar drive there as to why you would want to marry the person that you're in a relationship with. Not to discount other types of relationships, obviously, but there's that real desire to affirm what's already there. And even though it, in a lot of material respects, it doesn't change a lot, it's different.
Yes.
And so for me, that's kind of what baptism gets at. It's that real drive of I need to affirm this. I need to do something to affirm whatever it is that's happening internally. But which is again why I come down more on the believer baptism side of things rather than the infant one. But not that I would invalidate any infant baptisms or rail against anyone who was in favour of it, because I think all three of us probably have a pretty inclusive position ultimately, but so it's not, and also to say that it's just a marker or a public declaration also undersells it for me, the same way that boiling a wedding down to that feels like it's underselling it. It's because there is something else that's happening there, and it is the ritual itself that becomes a conduit for this other thing that's happening. But at the same time, if you feel that way about your partner and you don't get married, it doesn't change the relationship either. But
there is a sense in which it does need to be performative. Like there has to be an audience. If someone comes to you and says, "I've baptized myself in the bathtub," we don't really consider that legitimate. And in the same way, when a couple who have been carrying on without being married say, "Well, we married each other in our hearts," we don't really tend to count that as a marriage, because a marriage and a baptism aren't just about the couple or the person being baptized, but they're also about the audience who is actually witnessing it. There's something powerful in the witnessing of those events that actually makes them meaningful in a way that an unwitnessed event doesn't seem to count for us.
I mean, I would probably push back against that a little bit myself, though. because baptism can serve a few different purposes. Because again, to go back to the thing about infant baptism being about welcoming the child into the community, not all baptisms necessarily have to be a communal thing. Because again, if for the person being baptized, it is about creating the marker in time. If you happen to be in the bathtub and were an alcoholic and realized that you needed to turn your life around and did all this mental processing and decided that you were going to commit to sobriety after that and baptized yourself in the bathtub as part of a marker of that, if there was a big religious, if God had appeared to you in the bathroom or whatever, I think that would be a kind of legitimate baptism, but it would be doing something different to what something that was more of a communal public event would be.
It's a little bit hard to make an act of submission when you're doing it out of your own will and for your own purposes, though. So to me, and this is just to me, but I think Paul would say as well that baptism is an act of submission. You're actually saying, my life I die to, Christ's life I live to. And if that's the case, it can't really be. You can't submit to yourself and your own reason then in that sense. And so there's a sense in which, if I'm saying I'm going to be sober from this moment on, you're actually you're being baptized into sobriety, not into the church.
Yeah, I guess I've heard enough people have gone through the 12-step program, and God does enter into that enough that it's God's kind of baked into sobriety in my head a bit.
Yeah, of course.
And I think ultimately as well for me, if someone did baptize themselves in that kind of a context as well, I would ultimately just come down to the point of it's not my place to say that's between them and God.
Well, yeah, definitely. I think we're on the same page. I wouldn't tell someone it wasn't a real baptism.
No.
But if you were applying for church membership, that would be a problem.
Because the church doesn't recognise it.
And that was actually something that was actually my original angle that I wanted to take with this episode, that I decided I had some other stuff I wanted to say as well, is that when the question that we've got is, do we need to be baptized? That kind of begs the question, for what purpose? Because do you need to be baptized to enter the kingdom of God? I would say you should get baptized if it's feasible, but you don't have to. It's not.
That's right.
When push comes to shove, there's some other stuff that takes precedence.
And if you had to measure it, you'd probably say that you'd actually entered the kingdom before you asked to be baptized. Really.
However, do you need to be baptized to be part of certain church denominations? That's a different question. Yes, you do. Yes, you absolutely do. But that's our law, not God's.
It created quite a conflict for someone that I was studying with, being a part of Churches of Christ. But Churches of Christ, biblical literalists, what it says here is what we do, even to the point of absurdity sometimes, where there are branches of the Church of Christ where only a cappella singing is allowed, because Jesus sings a hymn at Gethsemane with the disciples, but it doesn't say there was music present. So you're allowed to sing hymns, you're just not allowed to have music.
Well, this is an interesting thing, because as someone who was baptized in the Church of Christ, they still baptized me with water rather than fire, which I'm glad they didn't take it literally in that respect.
Yes, otherwise you may not be here.
But there almost becomes this conflict where Paul helpfully reminds us that we're saved by grace through faith. We receive that. And so baptism is not for our salvation, but then church membership in Churches of Christ requires baptism. And that's not
Uniting Church.
And that's not a biblically literal reality. It doesn't say anywhere you must be baptized in order to be on the member roll of the church. But then, there wasn't the sort of legalities either back in those days. But there is this tension where we say you're saved by grace, and yet we're asking you to complete an act of some sort in order to become a member. And that was challenging for this particular individual. He saw a conflict between those.
What's good about that story is that he was wrestling in that.
Yeah.
It's when people just go through things without sitting in them, without wrestling them, just do it as a this is the next thing I have to do. So he was actually wrestling with it.
And of course, if you're listening to this podcast, then you're absolutely wrestling, because that's what this is all about. So present company, you're obviously accepted. So.
That raises a really interesting question, actually, that just popped into my head. Well, I think it's really interesting. Probably not that interesting. But traditionally you have been baptized as part of part of your church community, like where your community gathers, they witness your baptism. What about in the online sphere? What happens to baptism in online church, Lynn?
Well, really interesting, because we were talking just this last week. We met with someone who is the digital media consultant for one of the presbyteries here in South Australia, and also the person that you go to with IT concerns in another presbytery. And he actually posed this question. He said, "I wonder what baptism looks like in online," and I'm just going, "Oh, we haven't gone there yet." Communion online, I have no issues with, as we did in the last episode, but baptism online is one that I haven't actually sat in as yet.
What's your suspicion?
I think it depends on the circumstances, because I think what we find, I mean, one of the things about communion is that it is inclusive and not exclusive, and because that is the heart of God. Is that it's an inclusive. So if you had someone who was remote, no way of somebody authorised to do baptisms to be able to be in that position, perhaps who was near the end of life, or I don't know. I'm just trying to think of a scenario where I go, well, of course, I could conduct that online with the rest of the body of Christ, because I think that communal aspect in part is the fact that if you are incorporated into the family of God universally, worldwide, then in fact the people that you are with at the time, wherever you are, the congregation or the people, if you're down at the beach or whoever, they represent the family of God. So when we do it here at Adelaide West and there is the congregation there, they represent the family of God to the person being baptised. So in the online space, you still have the family of God. I think I would want to see that some of that would be synchronously rather than asynchronously.
Yeah, because
I think that's
as you were describing it, the way I was imagining it was as a live stream.
More of a live stream, that there are definitely people present at that time, even though we know God goes across time and space. I think for me that would be important.
Although, just on the topic of witnesses, isn't there a baptism in the book of Acts somewhere that's just one of the apostles on the road meets someone?
Yes.
Yeah, the eunuch.
Because
see, that just goes against what we've said. It's not communal.
Yeah, I mean, it's not communal, but it is still. It's still you're submitting. Like there's not just one person baptizing themselves. There is an apostle baptizing.
Which then raises the questions about the logistics of baptizing online. So would you have to be present with the person, and it would just be the witnesses online?
I'm saying
that's interesting.
Because I've never been entirely sure what I'm imagining when we've been talking about online baptism.
In that scenario,
you do the hands and then they duck.
They got to take the phone down with them.
Because what I'm imagining in that scenario, and I think that would be, because I think the best way would be to be with people in person. But we're saying if there was a place where the best way wasn't possible, then I think that, and this is somebody very remote, I'm thinking that actually we know that God, there's a mystery in baptism, and there's nothing special in my hands. It's all God's act, not mine. And so I think you could do that across. I wouldn't need to be with them actually baptising them. I think.
Yeah, well,
I'm not sure. I haven't sat in this.
No, I did ask you to speculate. I wasn't saying.
And we're wrestling with this live on air now, or in real time at least. So that's because I think it's probably good to think about what the purpose of having witnesses, or at least one other person there, actually is. And I think it is. Again, it goes back to even in my scenario of someone baptizing themselves in a bathtub, even in that, I fully concede that there's not that being welcomed into the community thing. And so really what it is so long as there is someone who is kind of representing the church and those who have been baptized to be there to welcome them in. And it's because, again, by yourself, it's like there's no connective tissue there. But there is the but it may facilitate the personal transformation side of it. Again, it depends on what. The type of baptism depends on what the purpose of it is, but I think you would be able to fulfill all of the needs through that as well, because I think the act of witnessing is what would bring the person in.
Yeah, I think so. And I think there, for instance, in Uniting in Worship, which is the Uniting Church liturgy and orders of service and all that type of thing, it talks about there if you're doing a baptism by an emergency, so clearly end of life and so forth. But interestingly, because it says there something like that, if you are baptised in that type of scenario, that if you then get better and you come back to health and so forth, to actually have a ceremony of sorts, even though you've been baptised, but have a ceremony of acknowledgement of that with the family of God, with the congregation, in community. So there's that recognition of that's the next step, that's what it sort of needs. And I just thought that was a funny thing to read, and if so it's acknowledging that God does something. And if that person returns to health, then, celebrate that baptism together with the community.
And I mean, I'm a big believer for finding any excuse to celebrate a bit. So.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And why wouldn't we? And the one thing we haven't talked about is actually because baptism is also a way that we relive our baptism. So for those of us who are watching, who are a part of this this ritual, this ceremony, this sacrament, there's just like wedding vows. I always encourage couples, as I prepare them for marriage, that when they go to weddings later on, that they say in their hearts those words, that because it's a memory, it's a way of renewing that covenant, so to speak. Well, it's exactly the same for us in baptism. We hear the words and we are to reimagine, to relive our baptism. So there's something for us in that as a community, as well as the person being baptised.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that even when I'm conducting baptism. For me, I haven't gone down into the water and come back up again. I've had water, hopefully liberally. I don't quite like it when I see baptism of infants and it's almost like they've been
drops.
dabbed with perfume. That's not baptism to me. Baptism to me is water.
They'll at least wash their hair, right?
I want water everywhere.
I mean, baptism was born out of Jewish cleansing rituals, so you want something that feels like it's got... we could at least pretend is cleaning. I think a quick dunk isn't really going to do much of a good job if you really want to get someone clean, but again, for ritual purposes.
It's right. So I like liberal water. When you pour the water, like we have a jug that goes next to the baptism font for an infant baptism, and you pour that and you splash it. That's to me something about the liberal love.
So you bring up the origins of the baptism ritual as a Hebrew cleansing ritual, but in actual fact, the historical documentary evidence is actually pretty sketchy on the origins of baptism. We say it's probably based on a Jewish cleansing rite because there's something that's sort of similarly close but not really, like washing the temple steps once a year with the jars of water. But probably in actual case, the closest facsimile in the Jewish worldview is actually the crossing of the Jordan, and the people actually entering into the Promised Land, where they go from being exiles on one side of the river to people the people of the promise on the other side. And so, John, it's not an accident that when we encounter John the Baptist baptizing people, he's actually baptizing them in the River Jordan. Yes. There is a sense in which he's actually saying to them, enter the kingdom, which is what happens to the Israelites. They come out of the exile in Egypt. They're led around the wilderness for 40 years. They come to the River Jordan, and then they suddenly become the kingdom of God in entering the promised land. And so there's a sense in which when John is baptizing them, in the Jordan, there's a sense in which they're actually saying, I'm renouncing all the other kingdoms of this world,
Yes.
and the true king is Jesus, and and this is what I'm following now. Except with John, obviously, before Jesus comes along as the Messiah, whoever that is going to be, because John hasn't met Jesus immediately before this.
Yeah.
Apart from kicking in the womb.
yeah.
John knows there's a Messiah coming. He knows there's a king, and he knows that this king needs a kingdom, that he needs these people to be prepared and to enter into enter into the land. So probably the closest image that we have in Jewish folklore, if you will, is actually the crossing of the River Jordan.
Now, to be totally clear, the information I was going from was when I spent, I'm not exaggerating, 5 minutes on Google last night.
Yeah. And I wasn't meaning to contradict you. It's not wrong.
No, and I wasn't taking it as such because, the thing that struck me when I came across, just because I wanted to just see if there were any, specific Bible verses that might trip me up, just because I, want to make sure that I'm, in line with Scripture as best as I can manage. The thing that struck me with that was simply the fact that water had been, because it is a cleansing ritual, and it would have been understood as such. You can see why John the Baptist had
for the remission of sin.
Yeah, he'd organised the ritual as he did, because it would have been something that it wouldn't have had to have been explained too much. People would have known what was going on.
And certainly, like N.T. Wright, the New Testament scholar, points out that the people of Israel feel like they're back in exile. Like they've come back from Babylon, but the presence of God hasn't returned to the temple in the way it was supposed to. The prosperity hasn't returned the way it was supposed to. So they feel like they're in exile. They're waiting for the true king to come. And the way that they know that God's favour has returned to them is the forgiveness of sins. So forgiveness of sins actually precedes Jesus, as the arrival of Jesus actually says your sins are forgiven.
Yes.
And so the act of baptising them in the Jordan has to be an act of forgiveness of sins. It has to be a cleansing of sin, because in order to enter the kingdom, you must have received God's forgiveness first. So that is, it's definitely a legitimate part. And certainly, water, it's not rocket science for us to be like, I washed my hands, it washes the dirt off. For us to go, water washes sins off. I don't think Christianity is unique in seeing water as a cleansing. I mean, I think the River Ganges is significant for that.
The thing is, water is really good for cleaning, and a lot of different cultures figured that out, because you don't stay a culture with alive people for long otherwise. If you can't figure water out, you're not going to be around long.
But I mean, there's a desire to tie baptism to something more familiar, because we want to be able to tie it to something that's not weird. So if we can tie it to Jewish heritage and we can tie it to cleansing, then it's less weird for us. In some respects.
Yeah, well, I think my reasoning for wanting to figure out, what may have preceded it was to try and figure out what it would have meant to people.
At the time.
At the time of John the Baptist. Because. While I don't think we necessarily need to go back to some perfect pure form where everything started necessarily, not even necessarily, I don't think we should do that. But it's more...
Sorry, Plato.
Yeah. It's more, if you can figure out what the cultural meaning would have been there, we can then try and preserve the meaning and translate that into the symbols that we have in our time and context. So that way the actual... sort of the spiritual heart of baptism is able to then be preserved as the ritual itself continues to evolve and be recreated by new groups of people.
And we have seen the meaning of baptism evolve over history. I mean, obviously in the early church, it's much more like what we talked about with John the Baptist, remission of sin, washing clean of sin in order to enter into the kingdom. In the Middle Ages, it's much more about receiving grace. This is the moment at which you receive salvation and the proper cleansing of sins. In the Reformation, it's not the external act of the water, but the internal act of the will being submitted to God that is what's transformative in baptism, and it's all about transforming our reasoning and surrendering our minds to and our internal life to God, rather than an external thing that comes and washes us clean. And then perhaps in more modern times, it's become a lot more about participation. It's about membership. And the more we can baptize, the better, because it means we're doing well, more members. So yeah, I mean, it's obviously shifted and changed over time. And once upon a time, people would never have dreamed of saying to the minister, when the minister said, "Are you interested in baptism?" They would never have, in their wildest imagination, said, "Oh, I want to be baptized at the beach," or "I want to be baptized at the cinema," or because it's not. It's
not
never.
where.
It's suddenly now become, in our post-secular world, a performative ritual where you actually get to act out something of. This is who I say to the world I am. And that's important for my happiness, that the world sees that I am actually making a declaration of identity here. And so baptism has much more of, it's much more about identity and place than it was perhaps for the original people who were baptized. And I don't think any of that's wrong.
No.
I think that all those senses actually have a place in baptism.
Yeah. And it's interesting talking about the identity stuff and the projecting sort of how you want to be perceived, I guess, because reflecting on my own baptism as a child, that was probably the biggest driving force of why I did it. It was because it was the thing that you did to be a good Christian. And the church that I went to had a lot of a lot of people, my own age, going through Sunday school and everything, who were, very committed to doing as well in Sunday school as they possibly could. Bless them.
So this was just part of that.
The good old days.
And I really did expect there to be this kind of big, I was expecting to really feel it when I went through it. And I also don't want to make it sound like I didn't do it sincerely, because I definitely did do it sincerely, because as I'm sure you can tell from what I'm saying, it was it was an act of desperate seeking. But it wasn't the miraculous turning point that it had been built up to be. And it's been interesting thinking about different points in my life that have felt more like baptisms, that I would say have been more of the, not to speak too literally, the baptisms of fire.
The turning points.
Reflecting, I think probably the most significant one actually happened on the 5th of January this year.
Oh, wow.
Because I actually legally changed my gender and name as of the 5th of January. So in 2017 or something, I started realizing that my gender was not what I'd always thought it had been, and that things were a lot more complicated than what I thought they were going to be, and have spent years wrestling through all that. And there's lots of different points along that whole process that, have been very significant in, sort of figuring out who it is that I am, who's God calling me to be, all that stuff.
Wrestling.
But for me, having the legal acknowledgement of the fact that I don't fit neatly into the category of man or woman. And then the name thing's actually a lesser known thing. I legally changed my name to my initials. I still go by James. So it's like my name hasn't changed. It's just legally changed.
We call you James.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
But that felt more freeing than I expected it to. That wound up being a bigger moment of self-understanding, affirmation, and that kind of thing, because I felt like I was really embracing who I was as I was called to be, not who I was trying to be based on external pressures more so. So for me, that feels much more like what I expected baptism to feel like.
And I think that what you've done there is actually absolutely hit the nail on the head. That is what baptism is. I think that's what baptism is built up to be for millennials it's about identity, and it's about confirming that true identity. And so for you, the real baptism was the performance of the true identity that you'd wrestled with to try and actually articulate.
But it was also the death to the old life part is also a big part of it as well, because obviously while the identity stuff is caught up in it, it's also a signifier of just how radically I'm prepared to reject, worldly constructs, and it's changed the way that I interact with other people as well, because by learning how to radically embrace myself, I've gotten so much better at radically embracing other people as well. And I've always prided myself on being able to do that, but I really feel like it's shifted into a new gear recently. And again, because, and this is also something that, like, as of the legal change, it's become, like, actually public knowledge. And so that has also, there's the public declaration stuff is all caught up in it. All that stuff. So, strangely, that was the thing that did the baptism thing for me, whereas the actual baptism that I had, it was a statement of commitment, but it wasn't that. It didn't have the marriage thing, it wasn't a wedding,
But for some that it is. I mean, obviously, I didn't have that as an infant either.
No.
And I had a growing awareness when I went through confirmation of what that was, and having had the joy, and it is joy. I'm just working with someone at the moment that by the time this comes out will probably be baptised, and who's an adult, and that is just a joy to be working through people in baptism. But in the baptisms that I've done, in the believers' baptisms that I've done, which have all been full immersion, a couple of years ago I did one with I think it was two 15-year-old boys around that age, and I was going to call them back at the end, but one of them in particular had this really emotional experience after that he could not explain, and it was teary and so forth, and he said, I'm just in this funny space, whereas for the other it was not. So we do have different ways of reacting to. I had last year, there were three. One was an 8-year-old, and some would say, is 8 old enough to be baptised? Well, I asked her what baptism meant for her, and she articulated baptism better than some adults. Yeah. She absolutely knew what she was doing. And when she came out of the water, that smile was so wide I could have fallen in. It was just, this is what I've longed for. And then others of us are just baptised. And baptism doesn't preclude transformative events in our Christian life. That I can remember many transformative events where I've suddenly just gone, aha moments, that perhaps have been a bit about identity in Christ. You're articulating identity in a very deep way that I probably, I haven't experienced it to that depth.
Yeah, it's not fun.
It's tough, isn't it?
Yeah, it's horrifying.
And so, but nevertheless, there've been those aha moments along the way. And where does it talk about being baptised metaphorically on a regular basis? It probably talks more about taking the Holy Spirit, receiving the Holy Spirit on a regular basis, but in a sense we do that in our baptism. We relive that baptism, and then God gives us these aha moments along the way that transform us and encourage us on the journey of faith. You said something about identity earlier as well, and particularly like for millennials, very much an identity, and I think for millennials in particular, is an age where authenticity is really important. And in fact, Dr. Christy Capper was over here now in Western Australia, but she did her whole thesis, her PhD, on authenticity and what that means for us. And I think there's an authenticity that you might actually be talking about in your journey just recently. There's an authenticity in baptism that speaks into our identity. In some way.
I think you have to be careful because not everybody's baptism will feel authentic to them.
True, they could just be going through the... ritual, so to speak.
I think more so for millennials, it's less authenticity is important, but that's perhaps more in like if I'm going to preach to someone and my life doesn't demonstrate what I'm saying, then there's an inauthenticity,
Yes.
and that's off-putting. But in your own baptism, it's not about your authenticity so much as in a social media world, everything that we do is broadcast. And when you're broadcasting, you're competing with other people for your identity and for the space to actually perform your identity and have it received by others. There's kind of this jostling for space, and I think baptism partly is a broadcast of an identity. You know, you're sort of saying that's. But to go back, there was a couple of things I wanted to reflect on what you and James had said, and I can't remember both of them, but the one that I remember is probably the most important one is that Jesus said, "Judge not unless you be judged yourself." And I think there's a sense in which when you judge someone, when you judge yourself, you actually judge other people by the same measure. You know, like the weight that you put on yourself, the burden that you put on yourself, you put on others. And when we come to baptism, it's very easy for us to speculate like this and talk about what's an authentic baptism versus what's let's not judge other people's baptism or other people's sense of what baptism means based on our criteria, because if we do that, we start putting criteria on our own baptism, on everybody else's baptism. We start creating burdens that Jesus never intended for us to carry. And it's important just to remember as we're having this conversation and as you're listening to this or watching this, remember that it is not our place to judge the baptism of others. So it's not my place to decide whether an infant's baptism is legitimate. That's for that person to decide and not for me.
Well, and for God as well.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
Yeah. And I think too that that's helpful. Like I was baptised as an infant. My husband Craig, got a few Craigs in my life. My husband Craig was baptised as an adult down at the sea. Both baptisms were valid in the life of the church, and we felt valid, in the eyes of God. But as Craig went out, we were engaged by that time. As Craig went out into the water, and I was watching back on the beach, I had a sense that I was. Because we were so close, I had this sense of experiencing that together with him, which I really appreciated.
Yeah.
And maybe authenticity in that sense where there's... I love that symbolism of a lot of water. I'm more than happy for it to be poured on people, but I love if I had my choice in the way that I was baptised, it would be down. It would be going down in the water and coming up again. That would be my choice, and I might even do it down at the beach because it's more like, or in a river, except the beach just seems cleaner. It might even be that I would do it that way because it felt more like what Jesus did.
Yeah.
And it wasn't some, dugout pond in the front of a church sort of thing, or a bathtub, which is what some churches do, or a spa, or whatever churches do. So maybe it would be that I would choose that because it seems more authentic to the experience that we read of in the Bible of Jesus and what John was doing. And so in that way, I don't know, it makes no difference. We have a wonderful baptism pond here, and it is, you step down into it, it's large, and it's heated. I've assisted with baptisms in the past, and you're in front of a whole lot of people, and as you're going into the water, you're saying to yourself, don't show this is cold, don't show this is cold. It's perfectly fine, but it is freezing. Whereas this one, you walk into and go, oh, it's warm. Oh, this is nice.
Yeah.
So we have a beautiful one here.
Find yourself having a dip and having a little swim.
The whole thing is a joy, and we often video it as well so that people that can't see in can actually see what's happening. I cry a lot at baptisms, and I've done that for years when I've watched baptisms on. I can remember going to a Willow Creek conference years ago, and they were showing the whole stack of people being baptised in a lake. And the more they baptised, the more I cried. And then I remember going with our daughter when she was part of Edge Church. and I went with her to her church a couple of times a year. And one day it was baptism, and I went, oh dear, that's not going to be good for me. I'm going to look away. So as it was, their baptism font was sort of around the back behind the stage area, but they filmed it, and so we would be singing this song, and there was about 30 people being baptized. We'd be singing this song, and so we'd have the words up there, and then as soon as somebody was baptized, they would flash up the baptism. Well, I was a mess, an absolute mess. I'm going, I'm not looking. Then they all clap and cheer, and I'm going, oh no. And the emotion is rising up. So I'm very emotional. In fact, I'm just emotional thinking about it now. I get quite emotional because it's such an incredible symbol. And it's transformative in people's lives.
It's potent.
It's potent. So you probably can't see, but I'm teary now just talking about it.
Yeah. You can hear it in your voice.
Yeah, I don't hide much, do I?
It's like me at weddings when I look at the poor groom looking so happy and about his impending slavery.
Oh, there's a big comment. We might need to talk about marriage sometime, do you think, in one of these?
Mutual submission. It's Pauline, you know.
Submit to each other out of reverence for Christ.
So does Naomi know this podcast is happening?
If you're watching this, Naomi treats me well.
You start blinking in Morse code. There was hearing you talk about the full immersion in the beach did get me thinking a bit that I'm wondering if part of the reason why that's such an appealing form of baptism for you is possibly because it lines up with the way that you encounter God more broadly, because being down at the beach where there's waves...
Yeah, I'm a beach person.
It means that there's a bit more... It kind of taps in a bit more to the wildness of God. There's more tie-ins into creation, whereas somewhere like the baptismal pool here, well, it's heated, it's a lot more comfortable.
A little sterile.
Yeah, well, but at the same time, if someone had, for example, like a history of abuse or whatever, and had really come to God as like a protector and a nurturer, being somewhere that's comfortable and safe and surrounded by loving people who are celebrating with you could be very healing there as well. So,
I agree.
So again, I think that the exact ways, the forms of baptism that I think appeal to us probably reflect how we come to God and how we interact with God personally as well, I think.
Yeah, I
never realised I had an option when I was baptised. Like when I was baptised, I was baptised in Devonport AOG, and it was Phil McCorkle was the name of the pastor, and he's in the States now. He's doing things with the Pentecostal movement in America, which would stagger the little church in Tasmania that he came from. But I was dipped in it was an in-ground pool type thing, but it was not in ground because it was in the foyer. So it was sitting on something, and then filled with water, and then done. It wasn't a pretty scene at all. There was nothing particularly aesthetic about it.
How old were you?
I was about 13, and I'd read. Was that when I read C.S. Lewis, or was that after? I think I read C.S. Lewis after that actually, but I was going through a time of passionate faith, and I wanted to get baptized because I think they put the call out, and I put my hand up. I managed. It was a time where my passion managed to overcome my anxiety of publicly putting my hand in the air, and I actually stepped forward to be baptized, and. For me, it was transformed. Like it was a moment of experiencing the transcendence of God. Like, so like the place that we did it, and the scene was mundane. It was ugly, almost. Like it was not a beautiful setting. It wasn't in a river or down by the beach, but it didn't matter. When I went into the water and came out again, there was something in me that was no longer mine. That I no longer belong to myself, and that I guess really is why I'm here today in the role that I am, because I submitted to something that if I'd had any sense of what it would have meant for me, I would never have done it. Instead of being here in ministry today, I probably would have been in the army, in the officer corps somewhere, doing something completely different. But once you start down that path of submitting to God, your life looks different, and you end up it ends up taking it. And so, I mean, like, I wonder in your case as well, like whether baptism wasn't the journey, it wasn't even the end of the journey, but actually the beginning of the journey.
Well, it kind of wasn't even the beginning of the journey, my actual baptism, because I was actually wanting to find a way to bring this in, so you've actually set me up perfectly.
And that was not pre-planned.
No.
Just in a conversation.
No, Craig's just reading my mind, apparently. I have a very clear moment of when I essentially came to faith, which fills a lot of the roles of more of the infant baptism type thing. Because I remember living in a little granny flat with my parents, and would have just been my sister at that time, just the two of us rather than all three of us at that point.
So you were young.
Yeah, I think it was 3, I'm going to say. So this is a very, very, very early memory. I remember it would have been, like, it was dark outside. I don't know what time of year it was, so I can't say how late it was, but I suspect it was around the middle of the year. And I remember my dad, like, Mum was there, but Dad was the one talking to me, and he was sort of explaining, like, you know, who God was and just giving me, like, the basics of Christianity and stuff. And I remember saying my first prayer that night, which was asking God to come into my heart.
Yeah, wow.
So for me, that was...
Get them while they're young.
Pretty much, yeah. But because I can remember it, and because I've always been, you know, very earnest and sincere, except when I'm not being sincere. But yeah, that to me was like, that was the real kickoff point.
You remember it. That's just amazing.
And so by the time I got to my baptism, I was hoping that that was going to somehow realize the thing that had been sown at that point.
Yeah. It's about 8 years later.
Yeah. And like, and again, I don't want to say like it was totally untransformative, because I do remember feeling a bit different, but it was... It felt like everything was only happening on that very, sort of the mundane, more material level of just, you know, I have just been through a ritual kind of a thing, as opposed to it kind of, you know, consummating anything almost. But at the same time, like it was still... There's a few things about my actual baptism that I think were kind of very apt in a way. I was the first person to be baptized in an evening service at my church, and there is something about getting baptized at night that felt very right somehow. And the Bible verse that I chose to read before I went into the water as well was the first few verses of Psalm 40, because I was really into U2 as a kid.
That explains something about your family environment, I suspect.
Yeah. Well, I was definitely the biggest U2 fan in the family.
Oh, okay.
Like, I grew up around it, but that was not an obsession that was bred into me. I came to that one myself. I can't help it if the Joshua Tree is a great album. I'm just going to pause here. This is James from the Edit Suite. For some reason, of all the things that I said in this series, this is the one comment I made that kept me up at night, so I just had to set the record straight on that. The reason why I mentioned the Joshua Tree here is because that was the album that got me into U2. I know that the song 40 is the last track on the album War, not the Joshua Tree. That's why I said what I said. Anyway, back to the episode.
A lot of people with you on that.
But even thinking back over those verses, just waiting patiently for the Lord who like lifts you out of the pit and sets you on the rock, like that. Like that felt like a prophetic act, at least in hindsight. And the church I grew up in as well, the baptismal pool was right at the front, at the foot of the cross that they had. Well, I presume they still have. So it was essentially behind the altar. Yeah. So every single church service, the baptismal pool was front and center. Yes. Yeah. And so there was something kind of
very churches.
I like that.
Yeah. But there was something very nice about getting it there, like the place that was there in front of me the whole time, and everything. So it was, there was something that was definitely was very much affirmed there. But again, it didn't have that real, dying to your old life, starting the new one kind of a sense that I was really hoping for. But I think it's just because I've been, I was really, really going hard trying to figure out what the Bible and what the gospel was actually asking from me as a child, that I think I'd actually done. Like it had just been it had been a long and slow burn for me, but a very intense one, but a long and slow burn for a long time. So,
and this was just another step in the journey. In a sense.
So my baptism hasn't been the biggest marker, but it has still definitely been a marker along the journey of my faith.
And that's interesting. Now you're a dad with a toddler and a baby, not much younger than what you were. When you actually. So it brings it a lot closer, doesn't it? Just how young that really was, and you haven't brought them for infant baptism.
No.
So like we did, we left that to our kids. So even our experiences, that they influence what we do as parents. In certain things.
Yeah, and I think the reason why we haven't even really considered infant baptism for our kids, I think again is probably, and I haven't really. This isn't a thought that I've necessarily had before, but I think I'm articulating sort of what my feeling has been, is that because infant baptism is a very bringing a child into a community kind of a thing, and we don't really have, we're not really part of a church community in that respect anymore, because
in person.
Yeah, in that in person.
That's right.
Because obviously I'm getting my church online, and Amy is kind of choosing to honour God by spending as much time with the kids as she can, because they're only young once.
As you know, because they're growing up quickly.
Yes. So it means that that act of saying you will be part of this community, there's almost like a legacy thing to that, but we're not entrenched in a community in a way where that would feel entirely appropriate. But the fact that neither Amy or I were baptized as infants either means that there's not really a cultural precedent there either.
Yeah. And we were completely entrenched in a community, but we decided to leave that for them, so that it could be a true believer's baptism.
A true believer's baptism.
True baptism. That's a careful.
I feel like you've loaded that one up.
I think I might have too, but
let's therapize this.
They made the decision, not us. That's what I mean.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm just teasing.
When things are on here, they're just, you've got to be very careful of your words, don't you?
I'm just looking for a fight now. That's all that is.
I mean, we haven't had one yet, so
no, but we have had robust discussions, and I think the fact that we all have different experiences and different church experiences as well is very adds a whole lot of life to our discussions. And this has been born out of discussions that we've had after doing church online and so forth. And we've had such deep discussions about faith and what it means to follow Jesus, and now about baptism and communion and other questions that you're going to come up with. It just
we'll come. Technically, Craig came up with this one because.
Well, there you go.
Well, basically,
good.
Well, we got to the end of the communion episode, and then you had a couple of things that you thought might actually heat up the conversation a bit.
Yeah.
And then we realised that we could have that about baptism pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Get baptized became the question. So that's So that's why I'm crediting you with that one, because I wash my hands.
Which is actually the symbol of baptism. Well, I think it's been helpful.
Yeah.
I think it's been a good to just explore and delve.
And if you're watching online and you'd like to get baptised, please ask Lynn to baptise you online so that we can actually make this hypothetical dilemma a real one. I'd love to see Lynn wrestle with it and just watch from the sidelines as she writes a whole new theology.
And I would need to check with the Uniting Church as to whether that's okay.
Start a new denomination. It'll be fine.
So every time
that's worked before.
It's worked every time.
That's what it means to be a Protestant. Every time a bell rings, there's a new denomination.
We doth protest too much.
Oh dear.
Oh, well, that ran for about an hour as well. So
Yeah, okay, so go for an hour. There you
And,
go.
I feel we should now close in prayer. Just make it really awkward. Thank you for joining us. Open Ended is directed and produced by JC Finlay for Adelaide West Uniting Church, with music by Tadro Abbott.
If you would like to participate in our online church services, they are available on the Adelaide West Uniting Church YouTube channel from 10 a.m. every Sunday, Adelaide time.
if you would like to get in touch with us, send an email to churchonline@awuc.au. And you can visit our website at awuc.au.